Hello, my name is Vivek Chandra. I'm the principal of Kerogen Consultants. Kerogen Consultants is a boutique advisory firm for LNG and energy projects and commercialization of natural gas based in Australia. The concept I'm presenting today is the Kerogen LNG Project Success Index. This is an innovative new way of looking at LNG projects around the world. It's a quantitative scoring system for the evaluation of future LNG projects. These LNG projects are projects that may or may not have reached final investment decision. These projects could be under construction, they could be proposed, they could be very much in the early part of their marketing phase, they could be in any phase except that they're not currently producing LNG. This particular scoring system could be a little bit controversial, but I think that the time is right for an index like this to be proposed. The word success in my success index has not been defined. Success could be generally a project that will be producing LNG and on time, roughly on budget, and producing a rate of return that should be acceptable to its sponsors and financiers. But again, the definition of success index has not been defined. This presentation was first shown at the 7th LNG World Conference in Brisbane, Australia in early September 2012. Thank you. So why do we need such an index? The LNG industry has experienced tremendous growth over the last few years. From a select group of buyers and receiving LNG from a limited number of sellers a decade ago, we have now seen projects in every continent of the world. We are seeing projects being proposed by nearly all the significant energy companies of the world, and by some estimates there will be 50 countries involved in the LNG trade in the near future. As a buyer, as an investor, as a financier, it's not always clear which projects are more likely to become successful of all the plethora of proposed LNG projects. I understand from buyers that there are delegations from LNG projects visiting them continuously. And it's very hard for these buyers who may or may not be familiar with the upstream industry, with the LNG, with the gas reserves around the world, with the experience of the LNG sellers. They may not be familiar with the EPC or the engineering contractor that the sellers have used. They may not be familiar with the legal and fiscal regimes in the different countries where the LNG projects are being proposed. It's very difficult for the buyers, investors and financiers to really gauge which projects they should be backing, which projects they should be supporting, which projects they might consider buying the gas from, which projects they might consider financing. As we shall see, just because a project is being proposed by a blue chip company does not mean that the project is going to be, quote, successful in this index. And we've also seen that not all the projects being proposed by a particular company are of the same rank. In other words, a Shell might have some projects that are good projects in this index, but Shell may also be promoting projects that may or may not have the same characteristics of the good project. And as a buyer, or as an investor, or a financier, it's not always clear if the projects that Shell may be pushing, project A versus project B, is really better or not, or there's other reasons they're promoting it. There is also a need for a universally accepted scoring system. We have seen investment banks, we have seen other companies try to rank these projects, but their rankings tend not to cover as many factors as this one will, a criteria. The rankings tend not to be consistent, and the rankings tend not to be universally accepted. I think it's also important to say that the ranking that we are working on, that Kerogen has developed, is a ranking, a score in a snapshot in time. A project, as it evolves, as it as it matures, as it gets the right partners, reaches a different stage of marketing, the project's score will rise. So this should be seen as a rank in a point of time. At any given point, the project should be reassessed, all projects should be reassessed to see if the score has changed. And I do expect that the scores will be changed. That can actually be turned around, and actually this can be a tool for the project sponsors, the companies that are actually proposing these projects, to look at what are the weaknesses in their projects, what they can do to mitigate these weaknesses and risk, and once they have done that, they will see their scores actually rise. So what is this index? Well, the index is supposed to be an easy to use and understand system that aims to be as neutral and objective, quantitative and adaptable as possible. It's important to state that all the information that is used in the scoring system is typically publicly available information. It does not mean it's complete. It is the information that we are aware of at any given point in time. So what we've done is we've developed 30 criteria, and these criteria have been grouped into 4 major categories. Category 1 is the upstream criteria, and this upstream category, and this includes criteria such as the reserve life. How much reserves is the LNG project have access to? And this is defined by really a ratio of the requirements of the LNG project versus the 1P or the proved reserves available to this particular project. It's defined by the NGL content. As we all know, NGLs, which are basically the gas liquids, things like propane, butane, and very significantly condensates and ethane, these can make an enormous difference in a project economics. Projects that have NGLs tend to be much more profitable than projects that have very, very dry feed gas, such as the coal-bed methane projects have only methane with very little liquids. They are at a disadvantage to projects that have the feed gas which has NGLs in it. COT content, carbon dioxide content, is obviously something you want to have as low as possible. High carbon dioxide in a field requires additional gas processing. It may require more onerous environmental measures, greenhouse gas, etc. Many projects in Australia and other places are now required to re-inject the carbon dioxide into the ground, a very expensive procedure. And of course, if a project that has very high CO2, such as the Natuna gas field in Indonesia, 70% CO2, it basically makes the project uneconomic to move forward. Access to the field is really defined by how easy is the LNG operator's access to its gas field. Access is related to any kind of land rights issues, any kind of environmental issues, any kind of a local kind of unrest type issues, security issues, that all kind of rolls into access to the field. Is the field shared by other companies? How easy is it for the LNG project to secure that field? We have seen projects that are being proposed that don't actually have defined fields. That could be good, it could be bad, and we'll talk about how that works. The reservoir quality is basically a measure on how good the reservoir is, the porosity of the reservoir, the permeability of the reservoir, how easy it is to produce, the complication in the well design, etc. And the distance from field to plant is basically a measure of how much of a pipeline is required to bring the feed gas into the plant. There are many projects that are being proposed with extremely long feed gas pipelines. The Ichthys project comes to mind in Australia, which 400-kilometer pipeline. The Alaska LNG project would also have a much, much longer pipeline as well. That can impact the economics of the project. It adds a degree of complexity, adds a degree of cost overrun and schedule risk. Generally, the less the distance from the field to the project, the better it is. The next category is above ground. Above ground is things like how much support does the government, local, state, federal, give to this project? Is the security of personnel and equipment an issue? Is there terrorist activity? Is there unrest in the local area? Is there a native rights issue? Is the local population, the indigenous population, supportive of the project, or are they liable to protest against the project? As we have seen in so many countries. Canada comes to mind. Australia, of course, comes to mind. The next thing is a measure of the fiscal stability of the country or the state. If the taxation rules can change over time, that are in unpredictable ways, that could cause a problem for the economics of the project and adds another degree of risk for the operators and the financiers and potentially the buyers as well, because a lot of those costs are sometimes pushed back to the buyers. There's an environmental permits. Are the permits easy to obtain? How far along in the process are the permitting process is the particular company? Have they received the preliminary permits? Are they still working on these permits? That could be a big deal. We can see in the US, some of the export LNG projects, there is a major permitting issue. Some of them already received them, and some of them are still waiting for their permits. It's not clear when it will happen. Once these particular projects receive the permits, then their scores will improve. And the last is actually quite important, is the labor cost and availability. LNG projects, especially land-based LNG projects, tend to require massive amounts of labor to put the projects together. Labor has to be reliable, skilled, less likely to go on strikes, and its costs should be managed and controlled. A degree of how easy it is to handle the labor issues is what this criteria is measuring. The third category is technical. Is there much of a technology risk in the project? That could be a technology risk for the upstream side, for the LNG project itself, or any other aspect of it. An FLNG project, for instance, requires a significant amount of new technology to be developed. That is a risk to any buyers. If the new technology doesn't work, the technology has an overrun, it has a commissioning problem, these are all risks the buyer should be aware of. There are a certain number of contractors around the world who have built a lot of LNG projects. These are the engineering companies, the Bechtels, the Chiodas, the JGCs of the world, the Kellogg's of the world. If those companies are involved, that should give a degree of comfort to all the stakeholders of the project. However, we've seen some projects that have been put together by companies that are not as experienced as others. The Norwegian example is an example where a contractor who may not have been experienced in building LNG projects as some of the others, and the project had significant amount of commissioning problems and other technical issues once it even started operations. The stage of engineering is really a measure of how much work has been done. Are they in the pre-feed? Are they in the feed, which is the front-end engineering? Are they past the front-end engineering? They have engineering costs well defined. The uncertainty levels are quite low. And are they down into the construction phase? That all matters to how good of a handle does this project sponsors have on the cost and ultimately the profitability of the project. The last is kind of a measure on the estimate of the capital expenditure of the project itself. It's a capital expenditure per ton of output. We've seen this ratio dramatically change over the last few years from the low $500 to $1,000 per ton to now in Australia $3,000 or $4,000 per ton. Obviously, the more the cost, the tighter the margins for the sponsors and the bankers. LNG markets, after all, are becoming a global market. There is some degree, but not much, say on the prices that the companies can charge for their projects, for their particular LNG outputs. And so in many ways, these projects are price takers in a global market. And if their costs are higher than their neighboring projects, then they will suffer at a disadvantage. The last category is company and market. Company and market is a measure of how much experience the operator is the lead company, the lead energy company that's pushing this project, that is owning the project, that is taking the lead in the engineering, design, and the marketing. How much experience do they have in the LNG trade? Some projects are being proposed by companies that have never done this before. Santos is running the GLNG project. They are participant in a number of LNG projects, but they have never operated an LNG project. That is a degree of risk. Now, Santos has alleviated some of this problem by having partners such as Total and Kogas that are quite experienced. If a partner has good experience, points are given for that. The reason is that partners, especially companies such as Total and others, are take a very much of a hands-on approach to a project run by their partner, and they will provide a lot of important guidance and support. The alignment of the party is extremely important. We have seen a number of projects where all the cooks in the kitchen are not all cooking the same way. Gorgon is an example where we had large super majors involved, and the project, for many reasons, including the fact that there were large super majors involved, could not get all the partners aligned. Oftentimes companies are pushing their own particular projects and may not want to push a project that is also there in partnership with another partner. They may have different views on how a project should be developed. Woodside in the Sunrise project would like to see the gas either FLNG or potentially come into Darwin. Some of the other partners are maybe more open to it going to Timor-Leste. That's an issue. The next criteria is the buyer type. The buyer type is extremely important in my view. If the buyers are the main off-takers of an LNG project are actually companies that will put it into a portfolio, or a trading company such as Shell Trading or Total Trading, or even, if you can think of it, Petronas, which will potentially buy the gas from GLNG, use some of it in its domestic market, but may also then resell that gas. To me, that's not as good a situation than having gas being bought directly by an off-taker. An off-taker such as a Tokyo Electric or Tokyo Gas or anyone else, they are more likely to be watching over this project and more likely to provide a certain discipline to the project. If the off-taker of the project is also a sponsor of the project, they also have a very large equity stake in the project, and they're also putting it into a portfolio where the gas of this project will be mixed into all their other gases, such as British Gas, which will put its Australian project gas into its worldwide trading system. To me, that's a bit of a risk. It's a risk because it's a risk to other buyers, not a risk to BGS per se, because if the project slips or something else happens, BG can still find gas through its portfolio from other places, but a third party gas buyer directly contracting with that particular LNG project may be in a bit more difficulty. And the last criteria is actually the marketing stage. How far along are they in the marketing stage of the project? Is the project still in the MOU phase, or have they actually signed binding agreements with different companies, with their gas purchases? These are all important factors. So what we've done is basically taken those 30 or so criteria and put them in a scale of 1 to 4. The future plan is to actually expand the scale to 1 to 5 and make the criteria a bit more tightly defined, each score a bit more tightly defined. But at this stage, it's a 1 to 4 scale. These scales are then converted into a 0 to 100 scale based on weightings used for each criteria. The scores can be weighted by criteria or by category. This allows a user to stress the important factors to that particular user. If a user feels that upstream, such as the reserves and the quality of the gas, is more important than the company sponsors, the weightings can be changed accordingly. It's quite easy to do in the particular model. So the weightings can be changed by the individual criteria or by the categories itself. What we have seen is, as we change the weighting variations, the scores actually do not change dramatically. The project scores tend to be quite robust to each of the weightings, and that's quite important. The scoring again is based on reliable third-party information, but it may not be complete, and we're happy to modify the scores if presented with verifiable information. And I think it's also important to again say that these scores are a snapshot in time, as projects develop, mature, improve their various criteria, their scores will change. Thanks. For this first pass, I've basically looked at the Australian projects that are under construction or have been proposed pre and post FID. The projects I've looked at in the northwest part of Australia are Prelude, which is a Shell FLNG project, Wheatstone, which is a Chevron project, Ichthys, which is a project with a very long pipeline proposed by Impex and partners Total, Gorgon, which is another very large project proposed by Chevron and a few other large companies, Browse, which is a Woodside project, and the Sunrise project. Now the Sunrise is an interesting project because certain parties in the consortium have proposed it to become a floating LNG project, and other parties, including some of the host governments, have really pushed for it to become an onshore plant located in Timor-Leste. So I've tried to rate the project both as an FLNG project and as a Timor-Leste onshore project. In Queensland, I've looked at QC LNG, which is a British gas project, GLNG, which is Santos's run project, APLNG, which is an Origin Conoco project, Aero, which is Shell and PetroChina proposing that, and Fisherman Landing, which is run by a company called LNG World. In Papua New Guinea, I've looked at the Papua New Guinea LNG project, which is the large project by Exxon, Oil Search and Santos, and the Gulf LNG project, which is a smaller project proposed by Introil. There are a few other projects in Papua New Guinea that have been talked about, but I don't feel they're mature enough to be included in the rating as yet. The issue about FID being relevant or not, some people who have looked at this presentation have said that if a project has reached FID, the scoring is irrelevant, because FID implies that the project sponsors are happy with the project and are willing to spend billions of dollars at it. I disagree. I don't think that just because the project has achieved FID means that the project will ultimately be successful. I've chosen to include all the projects before or after FID, and I don't think the fact that they reached FID makes that much of a difference. It may change the maturity of their marketing and things like that and the engineering stage, but they still may not have solved all the problems. To compare against these Australian projects, I've looked at some key international projects out there. Two in North America, the Sabine Pass, which is by Cheniere in the US, and Kitimat, the Apache EOG project in Western Canada. In Africa, I've looked at Mozambique and Tanzania. The plan is over the next few months to also include the Israel LNG project that has been talked about, Cyprus LNG projects by Noble. There's a couple of floating LNG projects in Brazil. Venezuela and Iran are perpetual LNG project candidates. There's a very large field called the Abadi field, which in Indonesia that could be developed as a floating LNG with Shell and Impex. Sonoro project, which is a project in Sulawesi in Indonesia. And there's also a few other projects we will be looking at. The expectation is that I will try to put some of these new projects onto my website, www.kerogenconsultants.com. This slide shows you an example, actually two examples of how I actually did the scoring. Two projects, and I've only shown you, instead of all 30 of the criteria, I've only shown you about 6 of them here, just to kind of give you a feel for how the scoring is developed and how robust it really is. For instance, I've looked at the Prelude FLNG project, which is Shell's offshore FLNG project in the northwest part of Australia, versus the Sabine Pass project, which is the project proposed to export US shale gas out of Louisiana, Texas, basically Louisiana-Texas border. And it's a project being proposed by a company called Cheniere. It is a conversion of an existing regas terminal which was used to import LNG to now make it an export project. If you look at reserves, I think it's a known thing that Prelude is still struggling to find all the reserve that it requires to satisfy its 25 or 20 year life, and Prelude is actively looking at getting gas from other fields. So I have given Prelude a score of 2, which I have estimated their 1P reserves are 50 to 75% of actually their total requirement. Sabine Pass, on the other hand, doesn't really need dedicated reserves. Sabine Pass is hooked on to the American natural gas grid, and for all purposes, there's an infinite amount of gas in the natural gas grid in America. Because of this, Sabine Pass has access to as much gas as it could possibly ever want, and there's no particular situation where Sabine Pass will run out of gas. Of course, the US gas prices are very volatile and can go up and down, but in terms of access to reserves, Sabine Pass has more gas than it could actually ever need available to it on the US pipeline grid. On the other hand, the US pipeline grid has dry gas. Gas is typically processed and the liquids removed before it enters into the grid. Because of this, Sabine Pass does not get the economic benefit of having NGLs, LPGs, butanes, condensates in the gas, and it cannot sell that liquid separately. So they get a low score for that. Having said that, Prelude, on the other hand, has access to some fairly rich gas. Its CGR, its condensate gas ratio, is estimated to be 30 barrels per MCF or above. So they are actually in quite an interesting position where they can actually have an economic value stream from the liquids they will strip out of the gas coming from the wells, and they'll make a lot of money on that NGLs. So they get a good benefit. The higher the score, the better the benefit, the better it is. So they get a 3 for that. Because Prelude will largely be constructed in Korea, and thus the ship will be sailed to Australia, it's going to be relatively immune from the Australian labor issues or labor cost. So I've given them a very good score in terms of no labor issues expected for Prelude. Sabine Pass is in the US. The US is renowned for some very efficient, very productive labor at a relatively low cost. The Gulf Coast of America is particularly adept at building things, and there should be no problem with labor significance. So I've given them a high score as well. Prelude is an FLNG project. There are no currently producing FLNG projects in the world. Prelude is an extremely ambitious FLNG project, a very, very large ship, 400 meters or something like that. It's going to be the largest floating structure ever built. And there are a lot of technical issues, offloading issues, tank issues, structural issues, etc., etc. Because of this, I think there is a large degree of technical risk. There's a significant amount of unproven new technology, and Prelude gets a low score for that. On the other hand, Sabine Pass is basically going to buy technology, liquefaction technology off the shelf, very standard, nothing special, and there should be no technical issues expected. Sabine Pass also, because it's buying technology off the shelf and constructing it in America, its cost per ton will be less than $2,000 a ton, while Prelude, very much in part because of its very large scale, new technology and shell involved, we expect that cost per ton to be greater than $3,000. So they get a low score for that. Operator experience, because its Prelude is run by Shell. Shell is a very experienced LNG operator. They get good score for the operator experience. Shell operates well over one plant, probably operates about 6 or 7, 8 plants around the world. Well, Cheniere, on the other hand, it's a first-time operator for them, so they get a low score for that. So in the end of the day, I have not shown you all the scores, but it ratchets out to Prelude getting a score of 80.6 out of a score of 100 on an equal weighting system, while Sabine Pass gets a higher score of 83.3. In this slide, I'm trying to show the Australian projects that I've looked at. I have not named these projects for commercial reasons. I've just called them Northwest Shelf 1 to 7, PNG 1 and 2, and Queensland 1 to 5. And I've chose to kind of randomly block out certain numbers as well. So I have not shown you the Northwest 1 company and market score, for example. Not because anything special, but I've just blacked out some of the scores. The little moon, the circle, the more dark it is, the better it is. So in other words, Northwest 1 has a very high upstream score, a high above ground score, and a high company and market score, reasonably high technical score, a half technical score, and thus their score is pretty high overall. On the other hand, a Queensland 5 or a Queensland 4, they're really struggling in many fronts. There are no full black circles in these scores, and overall their ranking is much lower. Again, the scores are based on public information. We stand to be corrected. If there's new information shown to us, we're happy to change the score. And I have not shown all the scores purely for public reasons. So this is the KLPCI. This is the final average score on an equal weighting system. These weights can be changed on either the 4 categories, upstream, above ground, technical, and company market, or on the 30 criteria that go behind each of these 4 categories. So this is the first actual visualization of the scores. These are again the same Australian projects that we looked at before. And you can see that what I've done here is the blue line is using an equal weight, which is an arithmetic average of all 30 criteria or the 4 categories. The red line, the red bars, have weighting towards the upstream category. In other words, more credit is given to the upstream. So as you can see, some projects are quite good on the upstream, and their upstream score is higher than their equal weight score. Northwest 1 is one of them, PNG 2 is one of them, Queensland 5 is one of them, but there are also some projects like Queensland 3 or Queensland 1 where their upstream score is actually lower than their equal weighting score. So they are relatively weak on the upstream, and if the upstream is important for any particular buyer or financier, they should probably look carefully and maybe avoid the project with the low upstream weighting. The same system holds for company and market importance or the technical importance. What I think is quite interesting is really changing these weightings does not dramatically change where the projects rank. If you can group these 12 or so projects into 4 tiers. There's the tier 1 projects, which are Northwest 1, Northwest 2, and PNG 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. And those groups, the tiers, those large kind of categories really don't change much by putting the different weightings on each of those 30 individual criteria. This, I think, is quite relevant and quite important, that a good project is a good project no matter how you look at it, and a bad project or a weak project stays weak no matter how you look at it as well. Now it starts getting interesting. What I've actually done now is just taken the equal scores from the slide before, which is just the blue bars. Those are only the Australian projects, and now I've added 4 select international projects. The Sabine Pass, the Cheniere project, Tanzania LNG, which is proposed by by BG and others, Mozambique LNG, which is potentially the ENI Anadarko project, and the Kitimat, which is the Apache EOG project. What is quite interesting is how my first observation is that some of these international projects have some pretty high scores, and apart from the Kitimat one, they either fall in tier 1 or tier 2. The best project in the world, best project that I've looked at so far, is a Sabine Pass in the US. There's many good reasons for it. Though it is weak in terms of the company, it is very strong in technology, very strong in market, very strong in partners, very strong in reserves. Not so strong, obviously, in the NGLs, but strong in many ways, and that seems to give it a very high score. The Kitimat LNG project that's proposed by Apache and EOG doesn't rank as high. There are many issues that I see with the project. It did not rank high in terms of native permitting issues. Yes, they claim that some of the permits are done, but it's still, I think, quite difficult. There's a very long pipeline to be built. There is no infrastructure in that part of the world at all. Apache has never built an LNG project. Its partners are not, EOG is not particularly LNG experienced. There are a few issues that do hurt that project quite a bit. There again, the other tier 4 projects, the PNG2 and Queensland 5, Queensland 4 to a large extent. I would say that Queensland 4 is one of the very large LNG projects being built in Queensland, and it's not at this. And I really question whether it's as good as some of the other projects being built in Queensland. And all the Queensland projects are still ranked much lower than the Northwest 1, 2, and PNG 1, and of course the US and Tanzania. Mozambique rates less than Tanzania, partly because of the experience of Ajip and Anadarko is less than BG, partly because Mozambique has still a bit more of a security and infrastructure issue, but the scores are not significantly different. Both projects are in the tier 2. So my final observations are basically that I think that the KLPCI, the Kerogen LNG Project Success Index, can be a very useful tool. It can be used to get a snapshot of a future LNG project and allow users, especially LNG buyers, project and company investors and financiers, to compare projects in a fairly uniform and quantitative manner. As far as I know, there is no similar index anywhere in the world. It can be also used as an internal tool for the companies to really do a critical self-analysis of their projects and to identify areas of weakness. I think sometimes the companies tend to get too close to their own projects and don't actually see some of their weaknesses. Of course, I can name names, but I'd rather not. But not all the projects a particular company is proposing may be of the same high rank, and maybe the company should be better, more selective of which project it concentrates its limited resources on. So the projects, or not all Australian projects, are created equal. Should the government, my question is, should the government continue to support all projects equally? One can argue it's not the government's place to pick and choose between projects, but it already does that to a certain extent. Governments in Australia and other places compete with each other to attract projects. The Ichthys project is going to the Northern Territory in Australia because they didn't think that they could work with the WA government, the Western Australia government, as well as they can work with the Northern Territory government. Other projects are working with the WA government. So my question is, should the governments use an index like this? The governments are giving tax breaks, they're giving facilities, etc., a lot of support. Should they maybe support the projects that have a higher score as opposed to all the projects? It's a question. And the area of resource constraints in general, where we have very expensive labor, very limited labor, limited capital, very little infrastructure in many remote parts of the world. Should the governments and everybody else support projects with the higher scores rather than the lower score projects? And I think the last question is really that we've seen some of the US and East African projects have high scores, and how long can the Australian projects continue to dismiss and underestimate these high scoring projects, which I feel they seem to be doing quite often. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it. I'm happy to answer any questions. Please send me an email to my email address. This is something I hope that will gain some traction and people will accept something like this. And I'm very open to any kind of comments or suggestions for improvement. If you would like to incorporate this into your own company's analysis, please contact me and we'll figure out a way where I can assist you as you review and evaluate the plethora of LNG projects out there. Thanks.